But first thing, I'm going to have my paper going across my desk or my table. So we are in the landscape on your paper. So if you don't, you've got portrait, which is up and down vertical. You've got landscape that's across, horizontal. And you want to draw lightly. It's easier to erase when we draw lightly. And we're going to start out with some basic little guide shapes for placement on our page, okay? And I have to usually draw a little bit darker just so that you can see it, okay? Now, when I'm looking at this, and I've got my iPad here, if I can bring it under here and let you kind of see what we're going to sketch out. There are 3 pumpkins, and you have pumpkins that are what's called overlapping, one in front of the other. So we're going to draw the one that's in the front first, then which is the orange one, and then we'll work to the white one, and then back to the blue one. Okay. Okay, my basic shape that I'm going to do to begin with is we're going to work with like ovals and circles. So I'm going to kind of start at the middle of the page, but down in like the right corner. And I'm just going to lightly sketch out like an oval shape. Now I'm going to be probably erasing a lot or darkening a lot. So it doesn't have to be a perfect shape. And again, I can't really tell on my paper. I may have to go darker here for you guys to see it. And so after I get that first shape, then I'm going to go to that white pumpkin, and it is behind. So I'm not going to have the full like shape there. And I think I'm going to have a little bit more of a circular shape than oval shape, but again it goes kind of behind. And for you guys that are in class, this is kind of weird because you're hearing my instruction a whole lot quicker than what you're actually getting to see me do on paper. And if this doesn't work out well, actually having people in class and working during the week, I may just have a stream on like Fridays at a certain time, depending on when we can do that, because teachers sometimes we have faculty meetings on Fridays, and we're working in our rooms on Fridays. Okay, after I've done that little basic outline for my white pumpkin, I'm going to draw the shape for the blue one. Now the blue one is behind both of these. So right there. And with this you can see my whole page, and one of the things that my students learn, because you know, number one, if you've already viewed that video about color and then the one about background, I like to see background. I like to see color. I don't like to see white. In the past, students that have left a lot of white, it's not been an artistic choice, it's been I'm lazy and I don't want to do it choice. So that's why I like color and I like backgrounds. Okay? But the larger we draw our picture, the less background we have to worry about. Now, if you've already pre-planned or sketched out what you're doing and you've included a background and a detailed background, that's great, wonderful, and terrific. But a lot of the times we don't do that. Okay? Now, after we have our 3 shapes, we are going to basically place a little curve where we're going to place the stem of the pumpkin. So I'm going to start down here at the bottom and just do a little curve. And it's near the top of the shape. And this one's a little bit wider than, as I look at the one that's on the left, it's a little bit more narrow. And the one at the top must be a really large pumpkin because it is quite larger. And you can see, well, when I showed you the reference. When you talk about perspective, and when you're looking at things in nature, as things get farther away from you, they tend to look how? Smaller. Even though it's the same size, but as it gets farther away from you, it looks smaller. So if you've got something that's really large behind other things, then that means it's a very big object. Now after I have those little guidelines for where the stems are going to go, I'm going to go up to my blue pumpkin, the one in the back, and basically we're going to bring this line up and curve it out. Bring it in, because we want it getting smaller as it comes up and curves around. And we'll do something like that. Any part of the pumpkin that is like in the middle of that stem, we're going to erase. So let me grab my eraser. I'll go ahead and get rid of that. And we have some lines or texture lines, so I'm just going to lightly place where I'm going to have a line coming up through this and to the top. Now when we start drawing this right line that's going up through the stem, I want it to come together right at the top of the curve. And while I'm here at this pumpkin, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of lay out where the curves of the pumpkin are going to be. So we kind of pick one spot where we are viewing from, because where we're viewing from, the curve is going to change as it goes around the pumpkin. So the angle of the curve, I don't know how I would describe that, the angle of the curve. It changes direction based on how we're viewing the pumpkin. And then on the left here, we're getting kind of close there. So this one, the point at the top where the stem is kind of near where the other one is. And again, our first lines were guidelines, so if we need to change something, modify it, we'll be doing that in a little bit. Okay. Now, as we go through this, I'm going to add lines in for everything else, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to define my lines even more, and as I do that, I'll make them darker. And this one looks like there's just one line kind of going up in the middle here and curving. And right now this looks like the end of a banana to me, sticking out of my pumpkin. Now the last stem, it's going to be a curly stem. So when I draw my line here, going to get a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to bring up on the left side a little bit, bring it up on the right, and I'm going to let the right side define the curve. So I'm going to go up through here, And I am going to darken this because I'm going over some other lines of the other pumpkin and such. So once I kind of get that, I'm going to erase some here so I can clean it up a little bit more. And it makes it just a little bit easier for you to see what I'm doing. Now, once I've defined that curve, then I'll bring the left line up and let it touch, and bring the other one, let it touch. So again, we have overlapping again, and it's going to come through to the other side, and we're going to let it go up and come to a point. And the other stems had texture lines. This one really, I can only see like one little line kind of at the bottom here that comes partially up. And that's by viewing at my reference picture. This is kind of wide, so I think just for the way mine looks, I'm going to add in another little line here on the other side. I'm next going to do those curves for the pumpkin on the white one. Okay, after I have these penciled in, I'm going to go back and I'm just going to draw darker lines and define these a little bit better. And one thing, like I talked with on the shading scale, drawing darker because we want it really dark. I did find, and I wanted to show these. I didn't find them the other day. I couldn't remember where I placed them. But I do have a little pack of pencils I found at the Dollar Tree. And it was so weird. I don't know how well they are. I mean, like how well they draw. But they do have from like 2H up to 6B in the pencils. So if you have like drawing pencils, you can always get like a 4B or a 6B, and it makes it just a little bit easier if you get those darker values. Now the middle here, I will darken a little bit. So kind of like a shade 5. I'm putting some pressure on there, but not as much as I did for my outline. And I'm going to just draw some other like light lines that follow the direction of the stem. And again, let me see if I can zoom one more time. So Okay, the curves of the pumpkin. We kind of have them where they're at the bottom of the stem already defined. And when we work with, like right here at the bottom where we have a pumpkin, we're just going to kind of go and stop before we get there, because that line may change and we can define it better after we get those pumpkins. But when I'm getting up to the part where the lines are like away from the pumpkins that are below, as I draw that line, I want to make sure I have a good curve that comes down. And like when I do the one that's on top of it, I want to make sure I kind of bring it and let it touch before it gets to the edge, because I don't want it to like flow into the other part of the curve. I want to be able to see a definition between those two curves of the pumpkin. Same thing on back. I want to have a little curve so that we have a point. Same thing on the other side. When I bring it in, I want to get a little point there. I'm going to go now to the left one on the bottom. Again, stem first. And the way this one is looking, it looks like I have like a curve right here and like a little point area there. And again, I have a reference picture, and I want it to look similar to it, but that doesn't mean it has to look exactly perfectly like it. So if there's a little variation in the lines, that's okay. That's actually pretty good to have a little bit different. Normally when we draw stuff like this, I'll let people like choose what you want to have in the background, kind of like when we draw the Yoshi or the Taz. And again, right here at the top of the stem, I don't want to have like a perfect circle. I want to make it kind of wavy. Now when it comes to this white pumpkin, when I'm starting the curves for like the actual body of the pumpkin, we can see the bottom here, so we want to have a curve, a good curve on that. So when I'm bringing my lines down, and when I go to connect them, I don't want to connect just on that guideline of that circle or oval shape that I started out with. I can even like bring it below it just a little bit, or maybe above it just a little bit, but as long as I'm getting a nice curve. Okay, when we're doing the lines here, again, we're going to darken, and just like this one in the middle, I want to make sure I have a nice curve, and I want to have like a little point when they come together that's created. That helps to define that shape. And when drawing, I like to do like a base shape, sketch it in, and then go back and define. I'm not one of those artists that can just sit and draw and not have to do anything to guide them. I'm not one of those artists that can, and I've seen a lot of videos, like how-to videos on YouTube, where the person will actually just go with a Sharpie marker and start drawing. I'm not that brave. I'm not that confident in my lines just to start out with a marker. I like to pencil stuff in. Okay, this last pumpkin, similar to the left pumpkin, we want to make sure that we're curving the bottom of it. Okay, so when I do this, let's see, we want to kind of vary the shape at the bottom of the stem and then go in and do our pumpkin. And any part of the pumpkins from the top that didn't quite connect, once we get the bottom pumpkin in, we just want to make sure we connect those lines. Okay, after I have those outlines, when I talked about shading scale, I am going to start with the blue pumpkin that's on the top, and when we look at value of color, let me get my iPad back over here so you can see the reference picture, and I can't quite get my cord to reach, so I'll have to tilt it here. But when you look at value, of course your wider areas are lighter. So when we look on that scale, you know, these are going to be down in the lower areas, the 1s, 2s, and maybe 3s. The blue is going to be like 3, 4s, and 5s, and the orange pumpkin is going to be like 4, 5s, and 6s. It's not going to be a 7 because that would be like really, 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 really dark. So the only 7 part I want would be like right in the crevices, right there in those lines that we drew to define the edges of the pumpkin. Now, again, I'm going to start with the bluish pumpkin that's on the back. So that one, again, is like a medium value. So I'm going to put my pencil on the side, and again, I'm using that wooden pencil because it's just easier, I think, to shade with a wooden pencil compared to a mechanical pencil. So I'm going to put a little bit of pressure on here. And another thing when you're trying to do this, sometimes a sharper pencil doesn't work as well as one that's a little bit more dull and has been used a while. Sometimes you got to be careful when you're shading or blending. If you have anything, and I don't know how that's showing, I've got a little speck of eraser stuff that was underneath my page, and it created a little darker spot in my shading because there was something underneath it. Now the stem is kind of the same value. And when I'm talking about value, that's just the different shades of the graphite. We could also talk about value in color. So like red. Red is your basic color, your hue. And you have pinks that are in with red. So a pink would be a value of red. That value would be defined as a tint. Maroon is a value of red, and it's a shade of red. It's darker. You would add black to it. And we'll talk about colors and adding and getting those things later on in the semester. And I kind of didn't realize, but I had that cut off the top there. Okay, after I've put that base shade down, I'm going to get my Q-tip. And you can also do this with a tissue if you kind of make it pointed, but I'm just going to start, and again I'm going to do little circles to blend. That helps kind of fill in any kind of little white spot that I might have left when I was adding my graphite down for the shading there. And I'm working in sections, because if I try to go over the whole thing at once, you know, I could blend out some of those curved lines I drew in, and I don't want to lose those because they help define the pumpkin. They define the object. Okay, after I have that laid down, I'm going to go back with my pencil and I'm going to pick the areas that need to have a little bit darker shading. So that's usually right around those curves. So I'm just going to do like another kind of 4 or 5 shade here as it goes up. And when I'm adding the shading here, also like behind here in the bottom, you're going to have a little bit darker spot because the light's not quite hitting down there. So it's a little bit darker in that area. But this one part of the pumpkin where it curves, we're not going to have any, but just a little bit of shading there. We don't want it as dark. So I'm just going to kind of lightly go over it to show just a little bit changing of the value. And we're going to get a little bit, show that shape a little bit more when we add some highlights here in a moment. So when I go just to the right of this line, again, I'm going to darken and define it. And I'm kind of losing my lines a little bit up here. Now a highlight, I'm not going to really worry about that stem on this one because it's kind of blending in a whole lot. The only one little spot I'm going to have a little highlight is like on the curve, and I'm just going to go with my white eraser. And you might have like one that goes on the end of your pencil that has a little bit pointier edge or a flat edge. I've got a block. I also have this one I ordered from Amazon, and you can get click erasers too at like Walmart. But anything, and again, I like white erasers because they don't leave pink smears. Like when a regular eraser gets old, they can leave little pink smears. But I'm just going to erase a little highlight here. On the corner of the stem. And then on the pumpkin, on the curves, I'm just going to make a little highlight. And again, when I blended, it does make it just a little touch easier to erase a blended graphite than it does just plain drawing with it. So I'm going to go ahead and start placing in some graphite on my bottom right one. And I want this one to look a little bit darker than the one I just did, because they may not blend together as far as like from one to the other, but I want to make sure I have that different value because it's orange and it's darker. So I'm going to put a little bit more pressure on here. Now again, when I'm getting ready to do the stem here, the stem, I want it to be lighter because it's kind of similar to the one at the top as far as the value. Now at this point I have my base color down, so I'm going to go back with that Q-tip and just like I did with the pumpkin above. But before, and I was getting ready to do it opposite there, before I go to this darker area, I want to get this lighter area of the stem blended in. So I'm going to you go from light to dark, because if you start out with the dark part, then you're going to have a little bit too much graphite on your Q-tip where it picks it up. So do that lighter area first. I laid that graphite down going at an angle, and if I'd taken my time here, I could have followed the direction of the pumpkin. And just like with the top pumpkin, after I get this blended, I'm going to go back with my pencil and darken some around the edges here of the curves. But when I put that a little bit darker on the other side of it, it makes that shape pop out a little bit more. Okay, and where I can see the bottom of the pumpkin here, well, I'm throwing my pencil. They want to kind of darken down in there on the bottom a little bit more. Just a few little lines in the stem just to kind of help give it some texture. And I want to add highlights. And again, we're kind of working on the top of the pumpkin for the highlight, just picking up some of the graphite with our eraser. Okay, I'm going to do this last pumpkin real quick. Background on this, let's not worry about a background on this one since we got a late start. The only thing I want to do to this last pumpkin is with that stem, similar to the others, I'm going to have a little bit of a foreshade, just a little bit of pressure. And because, well, we could have added a little bit more shading on the stems, but we want our focal point to be on these pumpkins. And I'm not going to shade, per se, that last one because it was a white pumpkin. But even though it's white, it's not going to be perfectly, bright white. So I'm going to take my Q-tip that has the graphite on it, where we blended, and when we did that shading scale, if you'll recall, we're just going to do light circles and get a very light shade, very light value on this pumpkin. And when it comes to adding like the shaded parts, the like darker values at the curves, and let me go ahead and do a couple very carefully. And this is harder to do with a Q-tip. If we had a blending stump or a blending tortillon that is basically just rolled up paper, this is a tortillon, not a tortilla. I've had students say that, and it's a tortillon because it's hollow on the inside. A blending stump is the same thing, only it's not hollow. It's solid rolled up paper that has a point on the end that makes it easy for you to blend and shade in. So I'm just going to use what we've got here. And I'm just going to go across that line, and I'm going to try to stay to that side where it needs to be darker. And I'm just going to actually put a little bit more pressure with the Q-tip. And when, just like with the pencil, when I add a little bit more pressure with the Q-tip, it kind of smushes that graphite down into the paper and makes it a little bit darker. And plus, when we're right there on that line, it can also help us, we can pick up a little bit of that graphite from that line as well. And if you start running out of graphite when you're blending here and your white is staying white and you don't have a light gray, you may have to go back over here and like just pick up a little bit more graphite from one of the other pumpkins.